My name is Keith Banting. I am standing in for David Walker, who is Executive Director of the School of Policy Studies, but who is unwell and sends his regrets. He very much wishes he could have been here with us all today. So I'm in the School of Policy Studies. I'm a Stauffer-Dunning Fellow, a Professor Emeritus in Political Studies, and longer ago than I'm going to admit, I was Director of the School of Policy Studies. So, on behalf of the school and the Department of Political Studies, which is jointly sponsoring this, I'd like to welcome you to the 2019 F. Douglas Gibson Lecture. I would like to begin, as is our tradition now, to acknowledge the indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting today. The territory Kingston sits on. It has been the site of human occupation for thousands of years and is the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. The Gibson Lecture was established in 1988, which was the founding year of the School of Policy Studies. It was founded by friends and family to honor the memory of Mr. J. Douglas Gibson, Chairman of the Queen's University Board of Trustees from 1969 to 1975. And we're very honored today to have two of Mr. Gibson's sons with us today, one from Toronto and one flew in from New York to be with us today. So welcome to Douglas and Dawn Gibson. Thank you for coming. We're honored that you are here. The Gibson Lecture brings to Queen's every year an internationally renowned scholar or public figure to deliver a lecture on a topic relevant to the school's mandate. Past lecturers have included Professor Rebecca Blank, then Dean of the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at University of Michigan, Professor Robert Mundell of Columbia, Professor Susan Strange of the European University Institute, Tom Mann of the Brookings Institution, Amar Siamwala, who was from Thailand, John Ruggie, who at the time was Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Gordon Thiessen, the Governor of the Bank of Canada. More recently, Gibson Lectures have been given by Alvin Roth, also of Stanford, as is our speaker today, and Jerry Mashaw from Yale. Last year, the Gibson was given by Bob Rae, who at the time was Canada's Special Envoy to Myanmar. It is the tradition in the School of Policy Studies that the introduction of speakers is done by one of the students in the MPA class. And so I would like at this point to introduce Julia Pinella, who will introduce our speaker. Julia?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Julia Pinella, and I am an MPA 19 candidate. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jonathan Rodden of Stanford University. The title of this lecture is Why Cities Lose the Deep Roots of the Urban-Rural Political Divide. This lecture will explain the rise of urban-rural divide in majoritarian democracies and political representation in the United States and Canada. Jonathan Rodden is a professor of political science at Stanford, director of the Spatial Social Science Lab, and a senior fellow at Hoover Institution. Dr. Rodden is a widely published and respected scholar whose studies have explored federalism, fiscal decentralization, and issues related to state and local government finance around the world. His most recent work focuses on the comparative political economy of institutions and policy-oriented work on municipal bankruptcy. In addition to his scholarship, Dr. Rodden's interests include legislative bargaining, the distribution of budgetary transfers across regions, and the historical origins of contemporary political institutions and political cleavages. Dr. Jonathan Rodden's talk is sure to get us thinking and asking questions. Please use slido.com to ask those questions using the hashtag MPA19. Those watching via live stream can also pose questions using Slido. If you don't have a question, you can vote on other questions that are in interest to you. As in the past, we will pose questions also to the crowd. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Rodden.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And it's an honor to be here, and I want to start by explaining why. I feel like in some ways I started my career here. When I was a PhD student at Yale, as was mentioned in my introduction, I was working on federalism. And I was especially interested in Canadian federalism, and many of you here are probably aware of the fact that this has long been the place to study about and learn about Canadian federalism. So I spent some time visiting with a great group of scholars in economics and political science who study federalism back when I was a student, and really became fond of the place, and so it's a real pleasure to be back. My work has evolved over the years from thinking about federalism to thinking about the economic and political geography that underlie the way the federal systems work and the way resources are distributed and policies are made in different countries. And so I've always, all along I've been intrigued by Canadian-US comparisons, and so in my work on federalism, I drew on those comparisons. And in this work as well, this is the first time I think that I've really been able to present some of this to a Canadian audience, and so I really would like to make sure we get to, I've never used Slido before, but I'm looking forward to getting to that part of the conversation where I can hear back from some of you. I think I'll show you a lot of evidence and data from the United States, but toward the end I'll also show you some information I've gathered for Canada and try to see what we can learn by comparing the two. So the way this title of this book works is really there are two things happening in the book that I give equal weight to. The one is in the very small letters up there, the deep roots of the urban-rural political divide. And I'm trying to understand how it came to be that the correlation between population density and voting for parties of the left has become so overwhelming in countries around the world, but especially in majoritarian democracies. So places which have systems of winner-take-all, single-member districts. In the industrialized world, really I'm talking about Great Britain and places that were colonized by Great Britain. There has been a dramatic increase in the division between cities, suburbs, and rural areas. And so that's something that I want to try to understand. Where does that come from? Under what conditions is it most pronounced? But then the second thing I want to do is understand what are the implications of that for representation and for policy making. To foreshadow the argument, it's that parties of the left, parties that started out as parties of workers in the Industrial Revolution, have come to be kind of catch-all parties of cities. The parties that we call the left are really fundamentally urban parties in many settings. And because of the concentration of left voters in urban districts, this has implications for the translation of votes to seats and for representation in countries around the world. The book really focuses a lot on the United States, but several other countries as well. But I want to start off with a map that I made that hopefully is, I've intentionally left off all the identifying information. I think it's useful not to see the country borders and not to see the place names, but just to kind of look at this map, which is of the Great Lakes area. And so what I've done is I've taken precinct level data from Canadian elections. This is 2008, a year when there were Canadian federal elections and a US presidential election. So these are just precinct level election results. And red is votes for the left, and blue is votes for the right. And so you can see perhaps people can figure out what's what. But here's Toronto, and here's where we are. But you can see the clustering of left voters along the lakeshore and in the big cities. And eventually we'll see some more maps to show us that it has a lot to do with the 19th-century rail network as well. So this is a map that I made in the book. Unfortunately, publishers don't like color. Everything has to be in grayscale. So this is the map that I ended up with in the book, but it's just darker colors for the left, and then the colors get lighter as we move from left to right. But you can see that there's a concentration of left voters in cities, and one of the interesting things we can see here is that when we get to places where there is the international boundary, when you go from Detroit to Windsor, or when you up around Sarnia, Port Huron, when you go from one side of the border to the other, the vote share in the city center looks very similar, the same kind of pattern. And I'll show you some graphs, and we'll see this in a number of different ways as we go. But there's just an incredibly similar pattern of political geography in these two places. Of course, there are important differences, and I'm going to get to those. So the question here, what explains the pattern that we saw in those maps? I want to start by arguing this is not something that just happened recently. This is something that has deep roots in the era of heavy industry. This is something that really emerges, I think, from the mobilization of workers in the Industrial Revolution. But then since then, there's been some things that have happened, and this is something that's I focus mainly on the U.S. And I'd be interested in talking a bit more about how this works in Canada. But then the rise of non-economic issues in the United States, race is an important one. But of course, social issues like abortion, issues relating to morality, related to women, feminism, and so forth. These issues, when they become kind of incorporated in the political party system, it also has an impact on the political geography of support for the parties. And then finally, hopefully have some time to talk about globalization and the knowledge economy, the rise of the knowledge economy, the decline of manufacturing, and what this means for the geography of support for the parties. So then after getting through that, I think that's what I want to spend most of my time doing. Then at the end, I'll talk a bit about what are the implications of all this for representation. And so I'll talk about the United States, where I have the book tells a story about the concentration of Democrats in city centers, what happens when we draw districts on top of that geography, and what does that mean for the translation of votes to seats. There is a real underrepresentation of Democrats in state legislatures and in Congress relative to their vote share that many Americans blame exclusively on gerrymandering. So the story I want to tell is that it's much deeper than just gerrymandering. That is an important part of the story, but it also has to do with the geography of support for the parties. And then I want to think about how in a parliamentary system where the party system works a little bit differently, we have a pattern that is similar in some ways, but it has this interesting twist that I'd like to talk about and perhaps get your feedback on. So this is just starting out. I'm going to talk a little bit about Pennsylvania, and we're going to maybe move back and forth between Pennsylvania and talk about Southern Ontario a bit as well. But this is just these graphs. I guess we can't see the dots very well, but we can see the lines. That's good enough. This is the relationship between population density on the x-axis and Democratic presidential vote share on the y-axis. In Pennsylvania, starting over a 100-year period, starting in 1916 and going up to the last election. So you can see that initially the relationship in the early part of the century was negative. So Democrats were actually got larger vote shares in less dense areas, so in rural areas. And then we see a shift, and it begins with the nomination of Al Smith, the Democratic nominee for president. But then right after this is FDR and the New Deal. And so really around the New Deal, we see this sudden shift. And this is just looking at one state, but a lot of other industrialized states in the Northeast look just like this, where the Democrats are more of a rural party. And then rather suddenly, this correlation becomes positive. They become a party that is concentrated in dense areas. And so one of the things we see is that that relationship emerges, and it's pretty stable for a while, but then we see sometime around the 1980s, it starts to pick up again. It starts to increase. And then there's just been, I'll show you some more data that'll drive this home a little bit. But you see the slope on these lines just continually increases. To today, it's just astounding. The correlation between population density and Democratic voting is getting close to 1. It's almost just a perfect line in most of the US states, and certainly across states. So that's quite a pattern, and it's something that I'd like to understand a little better. So one of the things I want to start off by doing is just, as I already intimated, I think this is a story that starts with the Industrial Revolution, and I just want to kind of combat a little bit. I don't know how much of the media portrayal of U.S. elections, how much of that filters through in the Canadian media, but there was this impression this impression in the United States that the 2016 election, that post-industrial towns, places that had industry and lost it, voted overwhelmingly for Trump. And it's simply not the case. The correlation between population density and Democratic voting is very strong everywhere, including in parts of Pennsylvania that we might be thinking of. So here we have Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, which this is basically just a seam of coal in the ground where industrialization took place in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And this is Clinton's share of the two-party vote. So downtown Scranton and downtown Wilkes-Barre, it was north of 70%. And this was a little bit of, this was a bad performance for the Democrats. Obama's vote share earlier was even higher in those places. So the point is that there's a strong relationship as we go from the rural areas into the city center. Almost any place in Pennsylvania, we see a big increase in the Democratic vote share. And I'll kind of move quickly through these. This is true not only in these kind of larger places like Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, but even in smaller towns like Williamsport. This is Washington, Pennsylvania. And this is a town that I'll talk a bit more about, Reading, Pennsylvania. And so we can kind of see it on a larger map. And again, it doesn't come through as well here as I might like, but we'll be able to work through it. This is just the region around Philadelphia. And you can see there are a lot of satellite cities. So the way industrialization kind of worked in Philadelphia area is something like, I think, in southern Ontario as well, where there's a big center and there are a lot of smaller rail-based industrial centers, Allentown, Reading, Lancaster, Harrisburg, and so forth. There's also this, what some of us refer to as the Acela Corridor. There's this densely populated swath of industrialized areas that votes overwhelmingly for Democrats. And you see things like this throughout the country. So you see these industrial corridors along the railroad tracks between Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland. And you see these kind of ribbons of blue when you get the precinct level vote. So it's very misleading if you look at district level votes or if you look at county level votes. You see a lot of things that just look red or purple, but if you drill down to the precincts, you see a lot of fine detail that has this kind of quality of, when you see rivers and you see the seams of coal in the ground, places where early industrialization took place, you see strong Democratic voting even today. This is Pittsburgh and this corridor up to Youngstown and Cleveland, Akron. The same kind of pattern. And what you can't see on here is the railroads. But I have, I think, another picture that I can show you that. So this is that town of Reading, Pennsylvania that you saw in the earlier mapping. Now we're back to black and white, but the colors get darker as the Democratic vote share in 2016 increases. And so what I have here is actually the 19th century rail network, and each of these little dots is a rail node, so a place where goods could be loaded and unloaded from rail cars. And these tracks were all built, finished by the early 20th century. And these are not contemporary railroads, and some of them are not in use anymore. But you can see the legacy of, I view this as kind of a proxy for early industrialization. The places where these railroads are located are the places where there were factories early in the 20th century. And those are places where Democrats are still very strong today. And so we see a very similar pattern in lots of places. And so one way to see this is I just kind of zoomed by. This is a graph at the level of counties. So even every county in Pennsylvania, it's kind of a fractal kind of relationship. It's there at the state level, it's there at the district level, at the county level, but then we even go to the precinct level within counties. We can see that the correlation between population density on the x-axis again and Democratic vote share on the y-axis is strong. So here's that place, Berks County is where Reading, Pennsylvania is. These are some of the other counties we were just looking at. So that relationship just kind of reproduces itself. It's very strong. When you go from rural areas into even a small kind of community with a little bit of rental housing and a courthouse and some unionized school teachers and unionized municipal employees, you see a big increase in the Democratic vote share. And this relationship is strongest in the counties that had the most early industrialization. In places that didn't have much industry, it's a bit weaker. And so I told you about the rail nodes, and I showed you that little map. We can do some things with geographic information systems, find the rail nodes, and then find the precincts that are closest to them, and do some analysis of where are the railroads and where are the contemporary Democratic voters. And you get a graph that looks like something like this. So the x-axis is the distance from the nearest 19th century rail node in kilometers. And you can see that if you're very close to a historic rail node, Hillary Clinton's vote share was north of 60%. But then as you get further from a rail node, it decreases. Here I have Pennsylvania and Ohio. This is true in all of these industrialized states. So there's a concentration of Democrats in areas that were industrialized early in the 20th century. So this is now using some county level data from the United States. We can look at, one of the nice thing about counties in the US, and I think it's probably possible to do this in Canada as well. I've been trying to collect some data on this and haven't quite gotten there yet. But the nice thing about counties is it's a stable unit of analysis. It's been the same in most parts of the country since the 1800s. So we can collect data from the 1880 census or the 1920 census, and we can merge it together with contemporary political data. And so what I'm doing here in this top graph is this is the relationship between manufacturing as a share of total employment in the 1920 census. And again, this is the Democratic presidential vote share, so this is Hillary Clinton's share of the two-party vote in 2016. So this is kind of another way of seeing what we were seeing just a moment ago, that the places that had the most industrialization early in the 20th century have the strongest Democratic voting today. But then if we look at manufacturing today, just look at the contemporary census, so how much manufacturing is there today in a county, we see the opposite relationship. So places that have a lot of manufacturing today are actually more Republican. So there has been this a movement of manufacturing. Again, I think this story will work out pretty well in Canada as well. A movement of industrialization away from city centers, and even perhaps more so in the United States, where so many factories moved from places like Pennsylvania to the South early in the, very early after the New Deal in the 40s and 50s already, firms were moving to the South. But there was also a movement of factories from city centers to exurban and rural areas. There was a movement of rail-based industrialization to factories are now located at highway exchanges in a very different locations that are more rural. So a movement of manufacturing away from the city center from rail nodes to highway nodes. And along the way, the Democrats the Republicans have become the party of manufacturing. And the Democrats have lost that. Although the geography in some ways has stayed the same, in that the Democrats still dominate in those city centers where they once had, where the New Deal kind of initially took off, and where they initially recruited a kind of a generation of voters around the New Deal platforms. The party still dominates in those same places. And so one of the questions then is what accounts for that persistence? A lot of the story I tell has to do with housing, that once the built environment is there, it stays around for a long time. And so a lot of housing was built for workers in the early part of the 20th century. A lot of apartment buildings were built in a dense way near factories. People didn't have automobiles, they walked to work. There wasn't much public transportation yet initially. And so we have a lot of dense working class housing in proximity to factories, and then that continues to attract poor people and immigrants, and this is a big part of the story. But and this is the story that I think explains a lot of the variation, but I think there's more to it. So we can look around at some of the places I'm talking about, and it becomes a little bit implausible. Like, even a place like Reading, Pennsylvania that I showed you, it's really not the descendants of the workers in the factories who now live there. Reading is now overwhelmingly a Hispanic community. A lot of people have actually escaped the crisis in Puerto Rico and have moved to Reading. It is a very different population today than it was in the past. And this is true of many of these city centers. But some of these city centers are not full of new migrants who are poor, but some city centers, some of these old moribund city centers from the manufacturing era, like Boston, Seattle, and San Francisco, have become extremely expensive centers of the knowledge economy. So there's been a huge transformation of some cities and not others. And kind of remarkably, the Democrats have become the party of both the poor service workers in the old industrial cities that have not transformed themselves, but also the party of the very educated, high-income professionals who dominate the labor force in this class of new cities. And so this is something that needs a bit further explanation. So, if the story was all about the Industrial Revolution, then of course we would expect this, as the class cleavage has faded, we would expect this urban-rural polarization to fade as well. But in that graph I showed you earlier, the opposite was happening. Since the 1980s, it's only been increasing. So what accounts for that? Here is a graph that just in those graphs I showed you earlier, where there was population density on the x-axis, and then there was Democratic voting on the y-axis. What I'm going to now do is just take the coefficient. So I'm going to take a number that captures the strength of that relationship and plot those over time for different regions. And so the dark line is the original manufacturing core, so the Northeast and the upper Midwest, essentially. The dashed line is the non-southern states in the rest of the country, and then this line down here is the southern states. And so this kind of tells an interesting story about U.S. political geography, in that what this line represents is just how strong is the positive relationship between population density and democratic voting over time. And when it's negative, it actually means that the relationship was negative. So in the South, it was actually the Democrats who were more rural in the era of Southern Democrats up until fairly recently. But what we've seen is across these regions, we've seen a real increase ever since about the Reagan era in the 1980s. We've seen a convergence. The South, the North, and the rest of the country have all kind of come together to have a roughly similar and very strong, overwhelming correlation between density and democratic voting. So part of the story of the United States is the South has come to look like what the rest of the country already looked like in terms of the Democrats being an urban party. But what we don't really have yet is a good explanation of what happened during this period, where there's this explosive growth in urban-rural polarization. And so the story I tell in the book is that once a party becomes an urban party, and this happened with labor parties in Britain and Australia and New Zealand, and I think it eventually happens with the NDP in Canada, that once a party becomes an urban party, it has an urban base. In the case of the Democratic Party, the Democrats controlled city government in most of these old industrial cities. And so anyone that had an urban interest group that had some set of interest, the Democrats were the party that they would turn to. The Democrats start incorporating these other preferences of these other constituencies in cities, and they start adopting new platforms. And the same thing is happening on the other side in rural areas with Republicans. So we have this politicization of abortion that happens sometime in the late 70s and the early 1980s. Of course, the transformation of the parties with respect to race before that. And on each of these, the preferences, the concentration of African Americans after the Great Migration in urban city centers encourages the Democrats, which previously had been the party of racial oppression in the South, to become the party of the civil rights movement in the North. So slowly the Democratic Party transforms itself on that dimension. Something similar happens when it comes to abortion and gay rights and other related issues. And then the story I've been telling about the knowledge economy is one that also needs a little bit more development. So I'll spend a few minutes thinking about that. So we can get some indicators of all of this from surveys. So this is a survey called the General Social Survey in the United States, which has a lot of questions that are asked in the same way over time. So I'm able to make just some scales by averaging over a bunch of questions about economic issues and social issues. And what these lines represent, or we see on the bottom, that these scores go from left to right. So the smaller number is further left and a higher number is further right. We see that major city core areas are much more liberal on the economic dimension than their suburbs, and more liberal, in fact, also than smaller cities and then rural areas. But on the social dimension, we see something similar, although suburbs and urban areas are closer together. But again, we see a big difference, and it's one that's stable over time. In all the country is becoming a little bit more progressive on the social issue. But the places are still quite divergent, as you can imagine. Rural places are more conservative, and as we get into more dense places in city centers, they are further left. So one of the things I've tried to do is understand the changing issue dimensions of politics. So taking those same issue scales, what I'm doing here is looking over time at what best explains voting behavior. What best explains whether someone in the survey identifies as having voted for a Democrat or a Republican. And so in this instance, Americans use different colors than the rest of the world. The blue in the United States, for some reason, is left, and red is right, which is the opposite of what I think any other country does with its electoral maps and displays. But what you can see here is that in the early period, what these graphs convey, it's very simple. In the early period, in the 70s and early 80s, if you want to understand whether somebody was a Democrat or Republican, it was the economic dimension that divided them. But over time, the dividing line between the parties goes from really exclusively economic to this more diagonal line, so that it's a mixture of both economic and social issues. And I already showed you some data that suggests that the social issues are very strongly correlated with population density. So as this becomes a more salient issue, it just pushes the correlation between population density and democratic voting up. So I'd be interested to hear some feedback on the extent to which people think this is part of the story in the Canadian party system as well. I don't have a strong set of views on that, and I haven't really looked at the data enough yet to be able to weigh in on that. But I also briefly, before moving on, want to talk about the knowledge economy. This is one of the more kind of interesting aspects of the way the party systems have evolved. It was not the case in the 70s and 80s that if one was a college graduate, one was more likely to vote for the Democrats. It was the opposite, in fact. So what we can see here is the first graph is this county level data on the share of the population with a college degree, and this is the Democratic presidential vote. And I was able to get data going back to the 70s, and you can see there was a negative relationship. So the counties that had more educated people were more likely to vote for the Republicans in the 70s. Already that's starting to turn around in the Bill Clinton era, and then now by 2016, there's this very, very strong county level relationship between the share of the population that has a college degree and Democratic vote share. Something similar, we can get data on patents at the level of counties. The correlation between patents per thousand and Democratic voting, there was really no correlation in the 90s, but all of a sudden by now it's a very strong relationship. So these counties that issue a lot of patents, these knowledge economy hubs, have become overwhelmingly Democratic. So again, it's this story, I think, that what explains this is that the Democrats were already dominant in many of these areas where the knowledge economy took off. I think one good way to think about this is by thinking about what Americans refer to as the Massachusetts miracle. It was this moment when Massachusetts kind of transformed from a really down and out post-manufacturing place to a leading knowledge economy based on a set of collaborations between Harvard, MIT, and entrepreneurs and the Massachusetts government. And all of this was something that was carried out by a Democratic administration. The argument I make is really it's just the Democrats were already dominant in Massachusetts politics. That's who was around. That's who was in power. We see similar things in Seattle and San Francisco. The Democrats end up kind of teaming up with this emerging knowledge economy, and it becomes this additional, very kind of uncomfortable cleavage sitting along with the other ones, that the Democrats become simultaneously the party of poor service workers and urban knowledge economy professionals. But we see that kind of happening throughout this period. So left, and this is something that I trace out, some version of this seems to be happening in lots of other places. I think the same story can be told if you just look at labor voters in a place like Sydney or Melbourne. Places, old working class neighborhoods have kind of made this seamless transition from being working class neighborhoods to being very expensive apartments and houses that are now occupied by knowledge economy workers who are very well compensated, and the prices go way up. You see the same things in Vancouver and Toronto and several other places. So left parties become these very diverse, heterogeneous coalitions between poor service workers, minorities, students, well-compensated professionals. That's what left parties have become, and even the idea of the definition of left and right really seems to have changed as part of this process. So now I want to talk about the implications of all this, and then let's have a bit of a conversation. So what are the implications of the geographic concentration of left voters in city centers? In the United States, I argue that this makes it difficult for the Democrats to translate their votes to seats because we have such concentration of, we have districts in which Democrats, no matter how you draw them, are going to make up an overwhelming percentage of the population. So that's one part of the story that I spend a lot of time in the book on. I think I'll spend less time on today. But there's also another story that I think is very interesting that the United States right now is really kind of one of the most frequent stories we see when we turn on the news, is that the Democrats have become extremely internally divided. There is a division between the urban core of the Democratic Party and the suburban moderates who need to win in pivotal districts in order to win the legislature. And that is a classic old story that I think also is around in Canada, that has been around ever since the Industrial Revolution in majoritarian democracies. So what I want to argue about Canada is that it has led to, there's a bit, the same phenomenon has created a bit of a different implication, which is that there's a long-lasting split on the left between the Liberals and the NDP, and they suffer from kind of an ongoing coordination problem at the level of districts. And recently, this has all kind of manifested itself, for me anyway, in what I think are rather interesting debates about electoral reform. So let's see if we can get to that. This is just another way I want you to think about. I think this is a useful way of looking at some of the data we've been looking at before, to think about what this means when we draw districts. Okay, so this is a graph, the origin of which over here is Pittsburgh City Hall. And this is every precinct in Pennsylvania. And so what this is kilometers from Pittsburgh City Hall. So this is, as we move out from Pittsburgh and we look at all the precincts, we measure the distance of the centroid of each precinct to Pittsburgh. And what we see is this kind of stalactite-looking pattern, where whenever you get to a city of any size, the Democratic vote share is essentially 100% in the city center. It's 90%, 80%. Sometimes it actually really is 100%. Then as you move out into the suburbs, the Republican vote share dramatically increases, and then you get out into the rural periphery, and you get up to something like 70% on average. And then every time you get to a city, you see these kind of concentrations, these really dense concentrations of support for Democrats in city centers. The simple argument is that when you start drawing electoral districts, the process of drawing a single-member winner-take-all district is a process of grabbing some of these proximate dots, putting them together, and making them into a district. When you do that, you just can't help but create overwhelmingly Democratic districts in some of the big cities. But then another thing that can happen for the Democrats is that sometimes when you draw a district in a place like Harrisburg, which is a small city relative to the size of a congressional district, you end up with these very concentrated Democrats, the city not being large enough relative to the surrounding periphery to form a district. So it's better to have your voters more scattered. And then when you draw districts, you end up creating a skew in the distribution of partisanship across districts. So for almost any US city we look at, if you just zoom in on a metro area, kind of think about that same type of graph, where the origin of this is the city hall of that particular city. And then as we move out into the surrounding areas, we see an increase in Republican vote share. Kind of the shape of this function is different in different places, and in the book I spend a lot of time talking about some places it's flatter, some places it's steeper. In knowledge economy cities, it tends to be a lot flatter. The suburbs tend to be more democratic. So we could talk all about that more in the question and answer. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. But what happens when you draw these electoral districts, you inevitably end up creating a distribution of Democrats across districts that has a left skew like this. You end up with, this is just a histogram of the Democratic vote share across districts in Pennsylvania. And these are the districts that have actually been implemented, that were drawn by the districting commission. Actually, there is a districting commission, a bipartisan commission in Pennsylvania for the state legislature. The U.S. House of Representatives is another matter, and there was a recent lawsuit about that. But this is what we end up with the districts that were drawn for the state legislature. So what this means simply is that there's an intense concentration of Democrats in these urban core districts. These are the urban core districts. And then the districts that the Republicans win, they tend to win by smaller majorities. And so just in case you think that this is all about gerrymandering, I've also been working with a colleague that we've drawn our own computer-aided simulations. So we draw thousands of simulations, draw our own districts, according only to compactness and contiguity, kind of ignoring partisanship. When we simulate the districts, we get very similar things. We still get this really big left skew. So it's not just a matter of gerrymandering, it's also a matter of geography. And so what you end up with, this is a little bit different way of seeing it. Instead of partisanship, what I've done here is this is actually survey data at the level of districts. We've been able to get estimates of people's political preferences on a kind of an overall left-right dimension. And the idea here is that the urban districts tend to be much more liberal. They're further away from the median district than are the conservative districts. So and these around here, the national median district tends to be a suburban district, or a district that's kind of mixed between a small city and some rural area. But this is a difficulty for the Democrats, because if they allow the people in these urban districts, and so this is kind of the new kind of socialist wing of the Democratic Party comes from these districts. They want the platform to be out here somewhere. But the people in suburban Salt Lake City who just won these districts in the last 2018 election, they want the Democratic platform to be here somewhere. And so the distance between these is quite far, and it's a difficult thing for the Democrats to resolve. The story I want to tell about the Canadian party system is that if you have a similar kind of structure, this is kind of, I think this is part of the reason why there's been a long-term split in the Canadian party system on the left. That's the conjecture that I'd like to run by you and see what people think about this. But the idea is that in the United States, the Democrats are just an incredibly diverse party that runs the gamut from Ocasio-Cortez to suburban moderates who are trying to win in essentially Republican districts. Whereas in Canada, this has led to a long-term divide between the NDP and the Liberals. So in a place like Pennsylvania, we see here that over a long period of time, this is the Pennsylvania State Senate, that the vote share and the seat share are very different. The Republicans get a much larger seat share than their vote share, and this has been the case for a long time. This is not a new thing. This has been around really ever since World War II. But this one. This is one of my favorite graphs, and it didn't come through at all. So you remember that Pennsylvania graph with those stalactites? Southern Ontario looks exactly the same. So if you could see this graph, you would see that there's kind of a conservative vote share of something like around here in rural Ontario, and then every time, so this is Toronto, so there's this big stalactite here, overwhelming support for the left in downtown, and so every one of these small industrial outposts in southern Ontario. When you get to Hamilton, Kitchener, Kingston, and also, of course, the college towns as well. So places like Waterloo and so forth, you see these little stalactites, which are overwhelmingly support for the left. In the city center, they quickly kind of, with increasing support for the right as we move into the suburbs and the rural periphery. And so here's graphs that we can see. Just remember I showed you those distance from the city center and votes for the Conservative Party. This is in 2011. You see the exact same kind of shape to these graphs. That as you go from the city center out into the rural areas, you see a pretty dramatic increase in votes for the right, again with some interesting cross-city variation. Toronto and Vancouver look different than as we move further west. But I think the thing I want to sort of end on and talk about a little bit more is when I take those same graphs and I break them down by party. So let's take this kind of graph and let's revisit this, but let's break apart the Conservatives, the NDP, and the Liberals. And of course, there's lots more variation we could explore in Quebec and so forth, but for now I think it's useful just to look at these. So this is the 2011 election that we had been looking at. And so here we see what that relationship looks like for the Liberals. Here's what it looks like for the NDP, and here's what it looks like for the Conservatives. So the Conservative, that blue line looks just like the line for the Republicans in any U.S. city. That as you move out from the city center, the Conservative vote share increases. But what I think is interesting is it suggests that the NDP has really become a party that has specialized in city centers. It's really become a city center party in many parts of Canada. And of course, this varies a lot by province. It's very complicated. Canadian politics is complicated. Every province has its own party system, and it's a lot for someone who's not immersed to understand. But you do see this kind of pattern where the Liberals, as you move out from the city center, are more successful in suburban areas. But you also see that if you combine if you combine the Liberal and NDP vote share, it's often higher than the Conservative vote share. But this is what, to me, looks like a kind of a classic coordination dilemma. But if people on the left prefer one of the parties of the left to the right, but they can't coordinate on one party, you see lots of places where the Conservative vote share, even though it's 25, 30%, is sometimes they're the largest party. And so we see something like this. This is just looking at Winnipeg, it's kind of concentration of NDP support in the city center, and this kind of declining. It's kind of the area of greatest support for the Liberals is in the kind of inner ring suburbs and middle ring suburbs. In Vancouver, we see a really kind of interesting relationship where there's really the division between the NDP and the Liberals in this election was really quite a strong coordination problem, it seems to me. But what I think is kind of interesting to see as well is go back to Toronto and look at 2011, maybe go back and forth a couple times between 2011 and 2015, and just to kind of see how these have changed. So, there's just been a pretty dramatic decrease for the NDP across the board, but especially in the city center, and then just a big, real coordination on the left around the Liberals. The blue line, of course, does go down a bit, but a lot of the movement, of course, is from the NDP to the Liberals. So that is what is kind of fascinating to me. I think this is a part of Canadian politics that is quite obvious, I think, to anyone who watches it. But I think this geographic component is of the part that I think is interesting here. That the geography of having two parties on the left with this potential skew in the distribution of preferences across districts is what's interesting to me. If we just add up wasted votes, and what I mean by wasted votes are a vote that you received that was in a district that you lost, or a vote beyond what you needed to win a majority, those votes as a share of all votes received by a party, the NDP has wasted more of its votes than other parties, except for this period when the Canadian right sort of fractured. Everything was different for that period of time. But we see that the NDP, of course, has had a difficult time translating its votes to seats. And then this coordination problem I keep talking about. So these are places these are districts in which the right wins a victory, even though if you add up the votes for the left, the votes are larger, compared with the opposite. And you see that this kind of coordination problem in which the left receives more votes but loses the seat is something that happens quite often, as long as you're willing to go along with the idea that the Liberals and the NDP are the left and the Conservatives are the right, and that's something we might have to argue about. But if you take that perspective, you get this kind of graph. So it's the same underlying problem, but it has, I think, a different manifestation in Canada than in the strict two-party system of the U.S. That's kind of the message here. And so this is something I just want to leave you with, that this kind of divide between the Liberals and the NDP is kind of a classic political economy story that's been around since the era of heavy industry in European countries. This goes all the way back to the original entry into the electoral marketplace of labor parties in European countries. I think they also had this kind of skew in the distribution of preferences. The labor parties try to enter, and they start pushing the old liberal parties out. And so what happens in Britain and New Zealand is the old liberal parties basically get squeezed out of existence, and labor takes over on the left. And then the liberal Democrats kind of come back and reconstitute themselves in Britain, and they kind of come and go over time. But what I think is so interesting about Canada is that this same kind of split, that same liberal-labor tension that has been there, and it's been quite damaging to the parties of the left at different times in British politics, even in its own way in Australia, and for a time in New Zealand, that's become kind of a permanent fixture of Canadian politics. And this is something that in early 20th century Europe, these parties of the left, one of the solutions they came up with was proportional representation. And this is part of the story for where proportional representation came from. These incursions of these socialist parties and these workers' parties in these urban districts upset the apple cart of politics, and it led to a movement for proportional representation. And then what I want to leave us with is the ongoing debate about electoral reform in Canada. Still on the Liberal Party's webpage is this quote: "We're committed to ensuring that 2015 will be the last federal election conducted under the first-past-the-post voting system." So this is kind of a pattern we've seen ever since the Industrial Revolution, that if there's a mainstream party of the left and there's a kind of insurgent party of the left, the mainstream party of the left ends up really liking the majoritarian system. The insurgent party of the left is always pushing for proportional representation. So labor parties in the early 20th century, one of their founding beliefs was proportional representation. But as soon as the Labor Party overtook the Liberals, they became very fond of single-member districts. So the party that's trying to squeeze out the other Labor Party, or the other party of the left, is always in favor of single-member districts. The one that's trying to kind of enter, like the NDP, is always in favor of proportional representation. And it seemed to me like the Liberals were on the verge in 2011 of being squeezed out in the way that the Liberal Party was in the UK back in the early 20th century, the way Liberal parties have been squeezed out elsewhere. Seeing the writing on the wall, all of a sudden it seemed like the Liberal Party kind of embraced the idea of electoral reform, then achieved this big victory, and then all of a sudden electoral reform didn't seem like such a good idea. So that's an old story. It's one that we see over and over again. We've seen it in other places. Eventually New Zealand sort of broke through, not because of the parties, but because of citizens groups that really kind of kept pushing the issue and achieved it through referendum. So I think this debate about electoral reform in Canada is kind of fascinating from this geographic perspective. That's that's the material I wanted to get through. But I'm really looking forward to hearing some feedback on some of these propositions about Canadian politics, which may or may not resonate with people. But thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that talk. But while we're waiting for Slido to set up, I'd like to pose any questions to the crowd. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask? If not, you can always, oh, go ahead.
Before the Supreme Court now, there's this gerrymandering in two states, North Carolina and Maryland. And you mentioned that Pennsylvania has a bipartisan system. I know the Supreme Court has a difficult time making this decision from what I've read. Why isn't it mandated by the court or federally that every state should have a bipartisan system?
That's far too reasonable. Right. So it is in the hands of the states, and so I've been involved in some of these court cases. So I wrote a brief for the Supreme Court in the North Carolina and Maryland case that's coming up right now, and also in the previous Wisconsin case, trying to convince the court that one of the issues for the court is actually in whether it's possible to disentangle this political geography kind of story that I'm telling from gerrymandering. And so one of the things that we've done is we've used these redistricting simulations to actually show here's what a distribution of partisanship looks like from a nonpartisan algorithm, and here's what the actual distribution looks like that was created by the legislature, and there's a huge gap. So these are statistical outliers. So we can use this to show the court that in fact a gerrymander has taken place. But your question is as to why the court doesn't insist on some kind of a system like is used in the rest of the world, for instance. It's just not something the court has seen. They've not seen themselves as able to wade into this, in part because of some of the difficulties of demonstrating a gerrymander. They have backed off from diving in because they're worried that they will be sucked into just endless lawsuits. So it's up to the voters to make the reforms. The kinds of reforms that you have in mind, I think, are not going to be court imposed. They will be imposed by voters in referenda. And we have in the last election, we actually had 3 states that passed overwhelmingly a referendum to try to create a citizens redistricting commission. So Michigan had one, Missouri had one, Utah had one. These are bipartisan. Voters from both sides tend to vote for these things. And so I think that's an encouraging movement, but it has a long way to go.
Any other questions from the crowd? Okay, so we're going to move over to the Slido questions here. So the first one is there any correlation between internal migration, for example, the Rust Belt northeast to south or southwest, rural south to north or west, and voting patterns?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the questions that I often get is when I show these patterns of voting behavior, and I show how they change over time. I was telling a story about the parties changing their platforms, and people who are already living in a particular place changing their voting behavior. But there's this other alternative explanation, where it's the people who are moving around. And I think that's the explanation that Americans often are more inclined to buy into. I think not enough people are moving for us to have seen the kind of dramatic increase we've seen in polarization. But I think that is part of the story. And it's one I've been very interested in because I think we have this narrative in the US that as people move and they sort into geographic space, that it's inevitably Democrats moving to more and more democratic places. But I think that's actually not what's happening currently. The current population movements, people who move are more likely to be Democrats. We can see that in the voter files when we track people and look at who's moving. But they're not all moving to downtown San Francisco. People are looking for affordable housing, and San Francisco does not provide that. And so the places that are growing most rapidly are these very sprawling parts of Houston, Orlando, Maricopa County, which is where Phoenix is located. These are the places that are growing most quickly, and these are actually some of the most politically heterogeneous places. So a lot of the movement is actually toward more mixing in the current moment, rather than increased polarization.
Thank you. So the next question is the left versus right characterization still the correct categorization to use, or are the traditional parties failing to represent much of the population?
Well, I think one of the things I argue in the book is that as more and more issue dimensions are added to politics, as the parties start to take positions on more and more issues, but the number of parties stays the same, the parties become increasingly heterogeneous. There's a kind of a paradox, at least in the US setting, where as the parties become more and more heterogeneous and difficult to even understand what they stand for, we're becoming more polarized at the same time. And perhaps those things go together. I think it's possible that because there's so much increasing social heterogeneity and only two parties to represent it, people start to feel further and further especially from the out party, but even from the party that they vote for. And in the survey data, I think we do see something like that. People are starting to feel more socially distant from, especially from the party that is their out party. And I think that is something that wouldn't happen to the same extent if we had a 5-party system or something the way we do in Northern Europe, for instance. That the strict American 2-party system really facilitates that growing sense of social polarization that perhaps is happening in Canada as well. I mean, it doesn't have the strict 2-party system of the US. It has more heterogeneity. But I do get the impression that this kind of urban-rural polarization, also mapping onto a sort of social polarization, is also happening in Canada. I'd love to get some people's thoughts on the severity of it and whether it's maybe perhaps less intractable or similar.
Just as a follow-up to that, I wonder if that has something to do with the lack of participation. People in voting, participating. Americans is very bad, ours is not much better.
Yeah.
So people just don't, there's nobody that they can find to vote for, so they just don't show up.
Yeah, I think that's a certainly, I mean, that's one thing we know is that in proportional representation systems, they have a wider variety of parties throughout the different, if we think of the issue space as having 2 dimensions, say a social dimension and an economic dimension, there are parties that fill in all those different spots in that space in say the Swedish party system. So if someone has preferences that are a bit to the left on economics but a bit to the right on social issues or vice versa, there's a party in the Swedish party system. So and often these are urban people. So urban Stockholm is a place that votes in large numbers for, the kind of wealthy, educated parts of Stockholm vote for a party of the right that is, on the economic right, that is kind of socially centrist. They coalesce with the right, but it is a party that we don't really have any option like that in the United States. And so so we know that the turnout is much higher in those places. So urban turnout is very high in European democracies. Urban turnout in the United States is just incredibly low, and it's not as bad in Canada, but it's also, if you look at those same kind of stalactite graphs where the y-axis is turnout, you see the same thing. Turnout drops as you move closer to the city center, and it's also true in Canada, but to a far lesser extent than the United States.
And we have a question to the right there.
Yeah, is age of voter a factor here? I mean, have you looked at the age range of voters? Am I making assumptions that rural voters tend to be older, urban voters tend to be younger? Is that a fair characterization?
It is, and I think that has a lot to do with, I think there are a number of factors, but part of it has to do with the presence of rental housing in city centers and the aspects of the labor market. But it is another one of those things that we can add to the demographic characteristics that make cities and rural areas different. The age structure is very different, but there's no inherent reason to necessarily argue that the age structure should map onto partisanship, but in the United States, it's really increasingly become a stronger correlation. It's hard to know which comes first, the geography or the demographics in that story. But absolutely, the correlation is very strong.
And to the left here?
So Jonathan, your story is primarily premised on trying to explain the democratic concentration in cities. So if you had, rather than that, tried to explain the Republican concentration in non-cities, would anything change? That's the first question. You just flip all the graphs. And relatedly, how do you compare your kind of analysis with the work of people who have been studying actually in urban areas with a different kind of method, more ethnographic work like Kathy Kramer's book, which really gets into a kind of identity, resentment, kind of a different kind of ideology, which isn't left-right, isn't necessarily social issues. It's about the ideology of resentment, of, I guess, being left behind. So there's kind of two questions wrapped in there.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the second one first. I've talked to Kathy a lot about this, and we see our work as kind of pushing in the same direction. I think that this sense of identity that emerges. I guess the question is, does it have any ideological basis or not? Is it just a completely divorced from ideology? I suspect the things are somewhat related, but there is a sense in which what Kathy describes is that people in rural areas feel that the power is elsewhere. They feel that the decisions are being made without their input, and a sense of resentment has emerged. And the question for me is that kind of an unrelated or orthogonal process, or is it also related to some of the changing positions and platforms of the parties? And I think the two things have to be related. I think that when the parties start to take platforms that increasingly seem distant, it facilitates this kind of social distance that she's describing. And it's there, in the other direction as well. I think the way urban residents often feel about rural residents. So I think the geography and the story about ideology, I think they go together. And the resentment that she describes is kind of is something that emerges, I think, as a result of this process. It's kind of an ongoing process that's one of the manifestations. I think there's still a lot more to learn about that. But the first question about whether anything changes if you kind of reverse whether the focal point of the story is the left or the right. I mean, in some ways, no. I think the rise of social issues. I could tell a story about the way in which those who abortion opponents had incentives to lobby Republicans rather than Democrats, and that's why the Republicans became the socially conservative party. I could tell stories like that about the agricultural sector, the manufacturing sector, and how the Republicans came to be associated with those. So I think in that sense it doesn't change. But I do want to highlight one interesting asymmetry, because you said, what if I examined the concentration of Republicans in rural areas? And I guess one of the things I'm trying to point out is that they're not concentrated. That there is an asymmetry. If it was just the case that there was a kind of a concentration of Democrats in cities and a concentration of Republicans in rural areas, then there wouldn't really be the same kind of implication for votes and seats as what we see. It's the fact that rural areas are actually kind of contrary to what people think. Rural areas are actually more politically heterogeneous, and urban areas are more homogeneous. And that's kind of, to me, that's a puzzle. So why is it that rural places, like a rural U.S. congressional district, if you look back at some of those histograms, we don't really have 80% Republican congressional districts. Maybe there might be one in West Texas or something. But for the most part, a solidly Republican district is going to be 60, 65%, whereas a solidly Democratic district is going to be 80% or something like that. And I think part of the answer has to do with things like, maybe it seems like a small thing, but I think unionized school teachers are everywhere. Schools are everywhere. And actually the public sector in rural America is a really large share of the economy. So unionized public sector workers are everywhere. There is, even places that seem rather homogeneous tend not to be. There are also colleges and universities everywhere in the United States, sort of spread out in rural areas. So there's a lot more going on in those places. And so you end up with this kind of spread of Republicans and concentration of Democrats.
But in spite of that, most congressional seats at elections go to the incumbent if the incumbent chooses to stand. And I've heard that one of the reasons that American politics is becoming so polarized, that there are so many safe seats in those states that choose to have the parties choose the nominee in a primary, it pushes people to the extreme. And I wondered if you could comment on, if that's true, if you could comment on states like California, which have chosen to have their primaries in a different way, as a way of depolarizing politics in the United States.
Yeah, I think the verdict is still out on this idea of depolarization through the top two primary system in California. I think there are a couple of studies that suggest perhaps it had a little bit of an impact, but then a couple of other studies that suggest it has no impact, and I don't know well enough how to disentangle the different claims being made. I think it's safe to say there's not any really clear evidence that California has become far less polarized since adopting this reform. But I think I share your intuition that the primary system is part of the issue, and that if we look at the way incumbents behave, it is often their concern, their real electoral threat is from a primary challenger, from a well-funded primary challenger emerging, and so the first order of business is to prevent that from happening, and that's by moving to the extremes. Worrying about the general election in many cases is just a much less important concern to them, and that's just a basic feature of a presidential system with this strong incumbency bias. It's very different. That's a very different feature than in the Canadian system, where the personal part of the vote is so much less important.
Thank you. We're going to go back to Slido now. And have immigrants impacted the politicization in urban and rural areas? Do they carry over their political beliefs from their home countries?
The last part of that question is a very good one, and I think people are just starting to try to understand that. I think there is some indication that that they do, but I mean, I think immigration and I think immigration is definitely a part. I could have even added to that list social issues, the rise of the knowledge economy. I think immigration is another one of these issues where the party's platforms in the U.S. have diverged in recent years, and it kind of is another issue where I think urban voters' preferences vary on the issue of immigration, and it pulls the parties apart. So I'm not sure if the question is really referring to immigration as an issue, or I guess, yeah, it's immigrants themselves. Like have immigrants moving to city centers added to the phenomenon that I described? And I think absolutely. When I described the fact that immigrants often, new immigrants arriving in a place, are looking for affordable housing and entry into the labor market in ways. City centers kind of provide that port of entry for immigrants. And so there's a strong concentration of immigrants in city centers everywhere in the world, and places like London. But I think the same is true in Canadian cities as well. There's a strong concentration of immigrants in places like the urban core of Winnipeg and really almost every city, and immigrants tend to vote for the left in lots of settings. But the last part of that question about social issues, I think there is some evidence also that immigrants and natives do have some different preferences on social issues.
So the next question we have here: how does Brexit look in your frame?
Oh, the Brexit electoral map looks even more extreme than some of the maps I showed you. But what is so interesting about Brexit is that it does break the parties. It does break the parties apart in that places in urban Britain, so urban core post-industrial places that vote overwhelmingly for Labor voted to leave. And so one of the things that I'm describing in this project is that that this transformation of the left from a party of urban workers to a party of urban workers plus knowledge economy workers has created a really difficult cleavage within these parties. And so this is part of what's happening with the cleavage within Labor, where there is part of the urban core Labor support base is the London knowledge economy Remain vote. But then, of course, the other big part of the Labor urban vote is this urban post-industrial Leave vote. And that's why Corbyn has tried so hard not to say anything as long as he possibly could. And that becomes a difficult game to play eventually.
Question from the crowd?
In Canada, the urban population seems to be growing and the rural population is dwindling, such that in the future there may be so few votes and seats here as to become almost irrelevant. Is the same thing happening in the US as well?
I guess this is why this all depends on how we define urban and this other category, which is actually the biggest category in both countries, which is suburban and rural. And so I don't know whether, I'd like to know what the trends are in Canada related to urban core versus suburban growth. In the United States, I think there's a misperception that the urban core has kind of rebounded and is growing again, and suburbanization has kind of passed its peak. That's only true if you are in New York or DC, and that's your kind of view of the world. But if you're like me and you're from St. Louis, or you're spending time in Cleveland or other parts of the country, in fact, suburbanization is still continuing apace, and city centers are still depopulating, and the country is becoming more and more suburban all the time. Less rural, less urban, more suburban. What I don't know is whether the same is true in Canada. So if anybody knows that, it would be interesting to, and I imagine it just varies a lot by region.
Sorry, just to go off what you asked, there was a recent kind of report that was done by Geographic here. He saw that in Canada, statistically, we are going more towards city.
I think most of the world this is the case, that even though there's much to celebrate about what cities bring in terms of productivity gains and quality of life and so forth, the movement still is toward more sprawl in most places. But what I think the question then, well, what does that mean for this whole story about the concentration of the left and representation and so forth? It potentially means if the kind of the middle ring suburbs are the places where elections are won and lost, then it means perhaps that the pivotal, the movement can actually be toward more pivotal districts. And I think it is true in Canadian elections that when you look at what it is that drives, in addition to, lots of seats in Quebec, but a lot of the pivotal seats are suburban, the ones that go back and forth.
Question?
I think there's a split in Canada between cities where the housing cost is very high. That tends to drive immigration to the suburbs. And we're in Toronto now. It's quite an interesting conflict between the Ford government, which is highly conservative, and represents the suburbs. But there's a large immigrant population in the suburbs because the city central housing costs are so high. So it's an odd representation.
Yeah, so this is something that resonates in the United States as well, because some of the most democratic cities are the ones like the Bay Area, San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, where the housing costs are growing so rapidly that it's kind of one of the paradoxical things is it's causing people to move out to places that are more traditionally Republican, like exurban Houston. And so one of the things in the American context that everyone's kind of keeping an eye on is this slow movement of places like Texas and Arizona and Georgia toward the Democratic parties. And this gets back to a question someone asked earlier, because of this migration, and a big part of it is related to housing. In California, which is essentially a one-party state at this point, I mean, it's almost like the Deep South back in the day, in the sense that there's really one party that competes. It doesn't mean we don't have partisan politics. In California, we have basically two coalitions, the YIMBYs and the NIMBYs. So the not in my backyard, and then the people who want to promote development. And so it's really what California politics is now about, is development versus anti-development. And that is something that I imagine is going to continue. In these really high cost of living, knowledge economy places, that's increasingly the cleavage that matters, and it has these interesting geographic effects. But the suburbanization of immigrants that you describe, the exact same thing is happening in American cities. So Cook County, which is where Chicago is I think it's the county that's losing population the fastest in the United States. But it's becoming wealthier and more gentrified. But a lot of the population it's losing is the African American population, which is suburbanizing. So African Americans are suburbanizing, and really rapidly, and also in the South, in Houston and Atlanta and places like that. And again, it also creates this more diverse, heterogeneous suburban environment. So it's kind of creating the same dynamic.
On Slido, you've mentioned how domestic affairs such as the manufacturing sector and social issues affect voting patterns. How do international affairs such as wars impact voting?
Well, when a war goes badly, it's bad for the incumbent, and that can be a very big deal. So I think we probably would not have had. Well, it was overdetermined. We had both a recession and an unpopular war prior to the 2008 election, but wars certainly can be an important. They can work. I think for both parties. It's not clear that one party necessarily gains or loses more than the other on this dimension, but it can certainly be a game changer when a party is in power and presides over a war that either is perceived as going well or going badly.
And the following question is, how did the 2008 recession impact the urban-rural divide in political geography?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we certainly see the urban-rural polarization pick up a little bit after the recession. But it's hard to disentangle. There's a lot of things going on at the same time. But I think some of the places that were hit especially hard by the mortgage crisis were kind of inner ring suburbs, and those are some of the places that moved a bit more toward the Democrats. So it's a good question. I don't think I have a very good answer. I can't tell a really clear story about the recession and this particular correlation that I'm talking about.
How has the Electoral College system contributed to cities losing? Would getting rid of the Electoral College help proportional representation?
Yeah, I think that the Electoral College is I mean, there are a few things that are all kind of working in a similar direction. The one that no one mentions that's the most important is the Senate, which dramatically overrepresents sparsely populated places. The Electoral College, it's not so much an issue of, the Electoral College seats are not so badly distributed across states. I mean, some of the smaller states are a bit overrepresented. To me, the main thing that the Electoral College does is it just creates a focus on an election night and campaign focus on Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Florida, and a couple of other places. So I think in this story, I think the Senate and the House, and that's kind of what I'm trying to contribute here, is to point out that the House in some ways is within states is even a bigger problem for the left than the Senate. But I think the electoral college is actually not, on this dimension, not really as important as those other institutions. Although there are plenty of reasons not to like it. But I think it's not, you know, it's not so clearly, it's not so clear as the House. I mean, if we one proposal that often gets made, let's use U.S. congressional districts as the electors in the Electoral College, rather than the states. Let's come up with a smaller geography. Let's use congressional districts. That proposal would be far better for the Republicans than the current arrangement.
But you did describe this as majoritarian democracies, and the last two presidents have not
Yes.
been elected by a majority.
No, right. I mean, like I said, there's lots of reasons not to like it. But on this kind of urban-rural dimension, two in a row is certainly impressive. But these other institutions are kind of pushing in the same direction, perhaps even in ways that are more pronounced.
We have a following question?
Yeah, just along the electoral college, isn't the sort of winner-take-all element of that kind of work against the proportional elements of fairness, so I guess to some degree, in other words, if you get a state to get all of it, but it's not proportionate, you actually want in most of the states, and others are some that are different.
Yes, I mean, it's just creating another one of these majoritarian, it creates the same kind of dynamic that I've been talking about that brings it to presidential elections. The only point I was trying to make is that the geographic scale of states is actually somewhat better for the Democrats than the geographic scale of congressional districts. But the same argument absolutely holds. And yes, I certainly don't mean to defend the Electoral College. Just to be clear.
So the next question is, what caused the Democrats in the U.S. to no longer represent the rural plantation regions?
Well, the Democrats if we look at electoral maps of the South, the Democrats get overwhelming support in the areas that, in the African-American neighborhoods in the South. It's become a highly polarized, almost a racialized party system. So that in the South, we can just look at the block group level census data on race and put that together with the precinct level data, and race kind of perfectly predicts voting behavior in big parts of the South. In the rural South, in cities, it becomes more complicated. There are far more white Democrats in southern cities, but in the South and in rural areas, it has become, the Democrats have become the party of since the Civil Rights Movement, have been the party of African Americans, and the Republicans have become the party of whites, and that's just kind of the way the party system works in the South. And there's a lot more to say about it than that, but that's just the descriptive pattern that we see in the data.
And we have a question in the corner there.
The Canadian part of the electoral system is so much different than the Americans. For example, Americans have a ladder system, so you can start at the local level and you can, as a Democrat, and go to the state level and the national level. We don't have that at all. Each level is different. And in fact, Ontario, the Liberal in British Columbia is very different than the Liberal Party. And so, and one of the implications of this is that because you can't move your way up, I don't think Canada's ever had a provincial premier who ever became prime minister. So that we have a much more egalitarian system, almost anybody did. And I just wondered, are we unique in the world in this case? And I don't know where I was talking about.
Well, I've been thinking about this. I do think the extent to which the party system, the division between federal and provincial politics has always been fascinating to me, because we don't see that so much in other federations. There's a lot more fluidity between levels, and the fact that the party system just changes at the provincial level and the federal level, and is just so kind of, people understand that these just two very different systems at both levels. That is rather unique. But I did want to, it does seem to me that there is back and forth within provinces between the municipal level and the provincial level. So maybe if anybody wants to break in and tell me that's not the case. It seems to be that within provinces we see more of that, but just as I understand yours, is that not the case?
No,
Oh, I see. So it's the fact that you have nonpartisan municipal elections in many cases. Huh, I see. So all three levels are really kind of cordoned off from one another. Yeah, I mean, in the United States, a career trajectory is one that starts in the school board and then goes to the state legislature and then Congress and so forth. But perhaps it helps depolarize in Canada to some extent. I don't know.
So one of our last questions on Slido is, other than voting, is political participation, such as party membership, divided geographically?
Well, that's something that varies depending on some states have party registration, and we can get really good data at the level of precincts or at the level of individuals actually on party registration. You can actually get the voter file and find out how someone is registered. In some states, there is no party registration. But one of the interesting things is that some parts of the country, party registration is not as well correlated with voting behavior as one might expect. So the South is one such place, Florida in particular. If you were trying to predict county level election results, you wouldn't want to look at registration rates because there are a lot of people who registered as Democrats back in the era of the Southern Democrats, and they never changed their registration. But yet these are places that are now very Republican. But then there are other parts of the country where the registration rates map pretty well onto partisan behavior. The idea of party membership is kind of different in the United States. It isn't really, we don't really have, membership isn't really such a concept as it is in parliamentary systems, but registration is, but it can be very strategic, and one changes one's registration depending on who's on the ballot and things like that.
Well, on behalf of the School of Policy Studies, I want to thank you so much for such an insightful talk. I think we learned a lot today in regards to the political divide between urban and rural areas. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it. Thank you.